I'm Jessica Kimball-Johnson. I'm the Director of Research here at Karsh. I also manage our Nau Lab on the history and principles of democracy. I'm delighted to introduce another conversation in our Touchstones of Democracy series, which is today, Educating the Ancient Citizen. Professor Arthur-Montagne is a faculty member in our Nau Lab. She is also a faculty member in the classics department at UVA. And we just adore her, and she is such a distinguished scholar. We're just thrilled that she's presenting today. So she will be introducing the speakers, moderating the discussion, and then she'll open the conversation to audience questions. So welcome, all of you, and we look forward to learning from you all today.
Thank you so much. A round of applause for Karsh for hosting us. I'd like to thank everyone here today. I'm just delighted by the number of folks who are interested in ancient citizenship, to this Touchstones of Democracy dialogue. For those of you who don't know me, my name is indeed Jackie Arthur-Montagne. I'm in the Department of Classics and in the Nau Lab. And today it's my privilege to moderate a conversation between our two featured and very distinguished guests. These include Josiah Ober, the Konstantin Mitsotakis Professor of Political Science and Classics at Stanford University, and also a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution. And our second guest, perhaps more familiar to our UVA crowd, is of course Professor John Ted Lendon, Professor of History in the Corcoran Department of History here at UVA. Our very distinguished guests have generously agreed to go California style with first names in this dialogue. So we'll be going by Jackie, Josh, and Ted, if everyone's comfortable with that. So our conversation today emerges from some key themes developed in Ted and Josh's recent books published by Princeton University Press. I've made sure you can actually see them on some of the back monitors here. From Ted, the 2022 study of That Tyrant Persuasion, which I'm going to pass around and folks can take a look at, on how rhetoric shaped the Roman world. And this book offers a riveting reevaluation of Roman historical events, laws, and even water fountains through the lens of Roman rhetorical education. Josh's forthcoming book, The Civic Bargain, How Democracy Survives, surveys several democratic case studies, including classical Athens, and Republican Rome. And in this book, he and his co-author, Brooke Manville, trace the functioning and sometimes the failure of 7 essential conditions of democracy, including civic friendship and civic education. And that will be coming out this September, if that timeline is in fact correct. So everyone can go grab a copy. Now, both of these studies address how education conditions political activity in periods where authoritarianism looms, and sometimes even overtakes democratic or no-boss self-governance. But there are also some meaningful differences in the ways in which our two guests define and discuss education, including the degree to which it shaped civic ideology in antiquity, and whether classical education was, to quote Ted, a force for cooperation and solidarity, or conversely, one of discord and rivalry. So I'm really looking forward to offering some guiding questions for the next 40 minutes or so, and then leaving some time at the end for audience questions or feedback. In the meantime, I'll go ahead and pass this around. I'd like to make sure I get it back at the end. It's invaluable to it. So, thank you. All right, the first question I'd like to start our touchstone conversation with is one of definitions. Today's event, as Jessica shared with us, is Educating the Ancient Citizen. What are some of the ways in which you define the practices of education in classical Athens and ancient Rome? And how is that different from the way we think of what educational institutions mean today? And as a sort of secondary question, your response is, in what ways could ancient education be said to be more or less democratic in terms of access, methods, engagement, than education, at least carried out in the 21st century? Ted, since education is at the core of your first 2 book chapters.
You have to start with
Okay.
because most of my responses are of a but right in Rome.
Okay, that's very well. I appreciate it. We'll start in chronological order then. Maybe you can take us to classical Athens, Josh.
Very good. Yeah. So I think the core thing to think about civic education in, let's say, democratic Athens. It's a very different world if we go to Sparta. So I'm going to focus on, because our book's about democracy, focus on Athens. You get similar kinds of things in other democratic Greek city-states, especially in the 4th and into the 3rd century, but we'll stick with Athens for the time being. So I think the key thing for the education of the citizen is that it is not a formal education. The state is not engaged with formal education, scandalously so, according to Aristotle and various other elite commentators. But rather, it is education via working the machine, so that you became educated as a Athenian citizen through your experience of life in the democratic polis. Your first, I think, key moment, quasi-citizen, was being officially accepted by your fellow demesmen, that is, the members of the village or the neighborhood in which you live, which was a formal part of the whole democratic apparatus. And you had to be voted in. Your father would come before the demesman and say, my son is legitimate, the son of my wife, you, myself, and basically have to ask for the approval of the deme. So the point here is that up to that point, there you are, 18, you're being presented by your father. It behooves you to live the life of the democratic young man. It does not behoove you to act like an oligarch who is likely to try to crash the whole democratic order, because after all, what the demesmen are officially voting on is, yes, you are a legitimate son of your father and your mother. Somehow, is that really true? I mean, a kid like that, acting like that, I don't know. There's could have some odd blood mixed in there. It isn't really truly Athenian seeming. So once again, I mean, the idea then is that the experience of your life, even up to that point, is one in which you are in the background of taking on board the norms of democratic citizenship, and having then been accepted, you will spend, depending on exactly where we are in Athenian history, but you will spend 2 years in, as it were, military service, first being trained and then serving to defend your country. Part of that is, once again, very self-consciously being trained in what was imagined, at least by the time of Aristotle, what is imagined as the proper attitudes of a democratic citizen, that is especially self-control. And then through the rest of your life, you can attend this assembly. You're very likely to be in a lottery in which you will be chosen as a magistrate, to sit on the council, to sit on the various magisterial boards. By the time if you happen to be lucky enough to achieve age 59, in your 60th year, you are expected to spend a year as a public arbitrator. You basically have to hang out a shingle and on a regular rotation. The magistrate who is in charge of dealing with various kinds of infractions and disputes will send the disputing citizens to you, and you have to try to come up with an equitable solution. If you fail, they go to court, but the idea is you're supposed. So all of this basically is education through living the life, working with the machine, even though, it is not. So I think that's the core, as I would see it, and obviously quite different from Bunny, run! You see, I tried to grab.
Rome is much more hierarchical. The number of people who can, as it were, work the machine and learn about the machine and about the working of their government is very small. In Athens, you have popular representation in in offices, in the assembly, and of the juries. In Rome, you only have it in the assemblies, which meet very infrequently, as opposed to how things work in Greece. So there's going to be less of that. On the other hand, Rome is an extraordinarily military state. And I think that Romans would say the important education, civic education, is what you get in the army. There is no real distinction at an early stage between the army and the citizen body. You go out into the army, you fight, you learn the most important things about being Roman, particularly courage, and then you go back and now you theoretically know them. And of course, on the other hand, by the time we can see Rome, it's some centuries on from Greece, they do have formal education. It's not state-sponsored, but they do have actual education, and it's, to our minds, extremely weird. That is, first you learn your letters. Pretty well everyone goes to a school to learn their letters, but then the sons of the aristocracy go on to learn poetry, which they call grammar, and then rhetoric. And what's peculiar about rhetoric is that most of it, rhetorical education, most of it is teaching young men to pretend to either talk to a sovereign assembly or to talk in a court. And it's all based on a mythical, sort of imaginary free republic. So you sort of get training from that about the free republic. Now, presumably after one of your questions, I can answer, I will go on to say, well, what happens under the empire? And that's even weirder.
Yeah. I thought you would take us there, but maybe we'll pause there. And thank you so much. I too am very interested in many ways, what you've both emphasized is that education is not sitting privately in a room, reading a heavy text, although there is, certainly some reading in classical Athens and more in Rome, but practicing, right? Like either through rhetorical performance or through working the machine, as you say. The next question I'd like to ask is more specifically about civic education. Josh, in your book, you note that when we talk publicly about civic education, usually what people associate with this is the Constitution, federalism, the democratic political process, a knowledge of our national political and social history. And also in Ted's book, you emphasize, the importance of laws and the way rhetoric will feed into the Roman legal system. But both of you also draw attention to the fact that there is something extra. There's another component to civic education, which I think both of you highlight is also going to be critical to the renovation of civic education in the 21st century. So I'm thinking here, poetry, right? Reading Homer and enacting a speech to Agamemnon, participating in public rituals and celebrations, attending theater performances. So how do you both see in your studies the role of culture, as we might frame it today, or the role of the humanities in civic education today, which sometimes just gets talked about as if it were a law degree, right? Go get a law degree and that's your civic education. Yeah.
So if we think about what do you do in a given year as an Athenian citizen, almost certainly in the course of the year, there will be an oration over the year's war debt. They tend to fight a war in most years. And the public oration is given in front of the collective remains of the war dead, not individual coffins, but the ashes, which are mixed into 10 collective urns, one for each of the 10 tribes. And then someone is chosen to elected to give the speech over the war dead. So the famous one is by Pericles in Thucydides, but we have several others surviving. We know these would happen every year. What do you hear in these things? Well, you hear history. Now, not Thucydides' history. You hear about the magnificent Athenian ancestral commitment to protecting the sacred lands, to acting together, to self-sacrifice against waves of dangerous invaders, starting with those terrifying Amazons. The women warriors coming off of the Central Asian steppes who almost took our city. You go up to the Acropolis if you want the visuals, and on the shield of the great statue, the cult statue of Athena, there you will see depicted on that shield the very battle on the walls of Athens, in which the heroes of Athens fought back against the Amazons who almost came in and took our sacred city. And then there's the Persians and so on and so forth. So you have certainly history on a regular basis, and you're hearing pretty much the same story year by year in this oration. You'll go to the theater and you will see once again the mythologized past presented to you in a way that is typically about one way and another problems of the relationship of individuals to and of families to a larger community. And you'll attend comedies in which the democratic community will be sort of put in your before you in a comic guise, but once again in a ways that sort of force you to say, is it all natural and right the way we do things? It actually gives you at least some way of thinking critically. And so that's only, part of it. But I think those are at least some parts of the ways in which what we would think of the humanities are built right into the yearly experience of the ordinary citizen.
Can I ask a question, please? This is not my question. This is a question I'm borrowing from a colleague. What about tragedy? Tragedy is normally thought to be actually sort of against the democracy, even subversive. But they listen to a lot of it. Is that, as it were, civic uneducation?
Yeah, so I think the question of what tragedy does is deeply complex. It certainly isn't ideological education. It isn't here is how to act. Be Creon and everything will work out really well in your community. Or be Antigone and everything will be work out well for you. But I think once again the way I tend to understand this anyway is not that we are seeing a kind of an anti-world, the aristocratic anti-world. Not that, this has been argued by very distinguished scholars, that this is a world in which we see the sort of the glittering heroes of the past. But for me, it's much more that we are confronted with the deep problems of relating to any kind of larger community when you're also connected to other kinds of personal relations, familial relationships, individual relations. So I don't want to reduce tragedy to that, but I think that there's a way to think of the way that tragedy works as an ongoing, as it were, interrogation of just how hard it is to live in any kind of larger community, given the complexity of personal attachments and, frankly, given the ongoing hierarchical relationships that even in the most democratic community never go away. There still are the very wealthy and the very poor. How do you deal with that? It's not easy, and I think the great thing about Greek tragedy is it doesn't pretend that it's easy.
Josh has a great chapter, and if anyone would like to get the title after this event, in which he talks about the way being in a collective audience watching a theater show, right, whether it's a drama or a comedy, and the way it will provoke dialogue then between the spectators, right? What does this mean, or how is this interpreted? It's not a fixed ideology, but a conversation beginning in some ways. Ted, if we could follow up with you, and you sort of left off by emphasizing the way that Roman education invites students to participate in the imaginary, right? But an imaginary of a fixed curriculum, right? You are speaking to particular characters or scenarios, often at the intersection of myth and history in the Greco-Roman world.
That's right.
Yeah.
I guess from the standpoint of, what is humanistic about their education, we're talking here about the formal education of rich young men. It is entirely humanistic. You spend years learning and memorizing poetry, either Homer or the Aeneid. And in fact, mostly the first two books of Homer, we happen to know from surviving papyri. And then you go on to read orators and work on your own oratorical style. I think what is remarkable to us is how narrow, exactly as you say, and intensive this education is, and how it leaves out things which we would consider important, like long division. So there is no instruction in science. There is no direct instruction in civics. That's just really not how it works. There's quite a lot of history introduced, but in an extremely bitty fashion, because you memorize for your rhetorical training exemplary stories about great Greeks and Romans, and then if you want, we have a couple of volumes surviving of what you memorize, the author Villiers Maximus particularly, and you go in here and if you want three men who became consul when they were blind, by God, they're there. All sorts of weird things. So they do get history, but they don't get any sense of chronology. It all seems to have happened in the past. The past is good. The past sort of happens at the same time. So far as civic training, it is exactly as you say. You are continuously faced with situations where you basically represent a figure of authority, essentially your own father, trying to work out various difficulties in the body politic, or even more frequently, in fact, in the family. So because, in old Rome, a lot of civic education is going to have happened in the family, right? And now you're going to school, but you're still working out things in the family. The state is in large part sort of a reflection of the family. The Romans would think, they call the Senate the fathers and this type of thing. So they would consider that probably to be civic education as well.
I'd like to take us in my next question to one of the most famous and contested events of Roman Republican history, and this is the assassination of Julius Caesar. The assassination of Caesar is a centerpiece of your chapter on the Roman Republic, and Ted, for you, your 3 chapters that sort of work through rhetoric's relationship to this, but you offer very different readings of this event. If I understand you correctly, Josh, you see Caesar's assassination as the sort of horrible endpoint of senatorial gridlock, right? This is where the Roman Republic and the Senate as an institution fails to be able to maintain a healthy civic bargain over whether or not Caesar's veterans should be given land grants. And Ted, for you, you really emphasize that the decision to assassinate Caesar is made by men who have been conditioned through decades of education that the slaying of tyrants is just. And one of my favorite parts of your book is you emphasize they didn't actually have a follow-up plan because everything in their education had told them that if you slay the tyrant, immediately your self-governance will be restored, right? So de facto it will happen. Can I ask you both to elaborate a little bit on why you chose to analyze this event in your respective studies, and why do you think it continues to be such a landmark event in discussions of democracy and danger in the broader historical and political discourse?
Go ahead.
Yeah, that's right, Rome first, yeah.
All right, yeah. I think that the question for us, for Brooke Manville and myself, really was to what extent does Roman history exemplify what we claim is a pattern within all citizen states, democracies defined in this really fairly minimal way as no boss government. Our core argument is that this requires an ongoing series of negotiations and ultimately bargains, binding agreements one between various parties, coalitions, typically, that have divergent interests, are aiming at something different. So you think about the early Roman history, and which at least as the Romans like to remember it, was a series of negotiated agreements between the dominant patricians and the insurgent, as it were, plebeians, agreements that came only after really hard bargaining, the plebeians withdrawing and saying, we don't really care if our city gets taken over by enemy X, because we don't really have any part in this anyway, and so who do we care who runs the show? At least it won't be your lot. And then the patricians say, no, without the plebeians, in fact, the enemy X will take us over. So, all right, let's cut a deal and get a series of these things going on. So this works very well for Rome, that they managed to create these series of bargains. And Rome thereby scales up, gets really to be massively huge, extends citizenship very widely. And by the time we're to the age of Caesar, we're in a whole different world. We're no longer nice little city states that can sort of pretend to be a single free republic. It can still pretend, but it is not. And so the question now is what kind of bargain is going to be made and who's going to be really at the table? So we have in the background, there are some real bargains being made between a few major power brokers, Caesar, Pompey, Crassus, the first triumvirate. They're cutting deals, but is there going to be a civic bargain such that there's a new negotiation about how we live our collective Roman lives together, and that's what breaks down. You know, that's what fails to happen. The impossibility ultimately of the Senate finding a way to cut a deal with Caesar that would protect his dignity, as he talked about, his honor, while maintaining the Republican form, ultimately leads you into this condition in which, well, Caesar apparently is the boss or is about to be the boss. And our whole origin story about getting rid of the king was, we don't do a boss, now what? That's but in Rome.
Yes. Remind me of the question.
It was so you in the beginning of your book you framed this sort of thesis that Roman rhetorical education is very much going to condition decision making and political action.
Okay.
And my question was why Caesar's assassination is a case study.
Right. Well,
Yes.
I mean, not for noble and ambitious reasons.
Yeah.
Like my colleague. It happens to work in my theory.
Mhm.
My theory in its broadest sense is not in anything that will be surprising to contemporary historians, which is the literary version of you are what you eat. That is to say, you do what you read. Your reading and your education sets up scripts. You follow those scripts with, in many cases, surprising literalness, even when it is extraordinarily impractical for you to do so, even if it leads to your death. Caesar episode does demonstrate that to me. And I was incredibly pleased that it did, because of course, this is the episode that most modern people, if they know anything about the Romans, know about, mostly through Shakespeare. Yeah, and so I like my reader always to come to what they're reading with some sort of background, and in this case, Shakespeare provides the background.
Can I ask a little bit of a follow-up question about the sort of scripts and the naturalness with which having had an education about tyrant slayers leads to activity? Does that change in the empire? Because there's so much concern about the right way to do declamations, and also expressions of anxiety about students not recognizing the difference between the artificiality, this is a word you use, especially in the artificiality of these readings and exercises versus actually participating in a civic context and not mouthing off to the emperor or the provincial governor just because you've given a declamation to Agamemnon, in school. Yeah.
Yes, that's right. I mean, when you speak of artificiality, we're talking about your teacher will give you a scenario such as a young man goes traveling. He is captured by pirates, usually pirates. There are lots of pirates running around. Yeah, in a world which under the empire had no pirates at all. The pirates send a letter back to his father saying, this is the ransom I want for your son. The father, who is pissed at his son, sends a letter back saying, I will give you that amount of money, but I will give you twice that amount of money if you cut his hands off. So it's not over, which is what's astonishing. The pirates do that, naturally. He eventually finds his way home. And many years later, his father falls into penury and sues the son for support. And then you speak either for the father, whose claims are that your duty to your father is completely, it does not suffer even if he has behaved incredibly badly, or the son who simply says, I have no hands. That is in fact a relatively unintricate scenario. Imagine thousands of people doing the same curriculum over 500 years. They elaborated things very considerably. But what amazes me, and what has amazed pretty well everyone else has looked at, is that this broad category of oratory declamation about tyrant slaying, based on the rule, the law, which is given that he who kills a tyrant may receive a reward from the city. This becomes, if anything, more popular under the empire. And there's only one person in reality to whom this could possibly apply, and that's the emperor. And we only have a tiny number of cases of emperors becoming irritated at professional rhetoricians for getting too close to the book. Basically, it's just completely allowed. It's the artificiality of the separation of it from reality that is sufficiently understood.
I think this dovetails as well with both of our findings that you can absolutely speak about tyrants and authoritarians, but not in a Roman historical context. You have to project them back into the pre-Alexander classical years, right? As you don't actually give a declamation in which you imagine speaking directly to an emperor. So that's striking. I have a little bit of a follow-up question on the Caesar episode. In my experience, historians sort of hate the tagline of "He who fails to learn history is doomed to repeat it," because history is not a predicative model in that sense. But when you think about teaching this material to students, is the takeaway story from the Caesar assassination episode that what we need to be learning in 21st century civic education are the critical skills of negotiation and conflict resolution? Or is it to pay more attention to the warning signs vis-a-vis the tyrant declamation episodes that will alert us when someone is emerging within our polis, within our community, who is a danger to democracy? Is it skills, or is it past models to learn from, or some combination? Yeah.
So I suppose that I'll have to take the skills side of it.
Please,
by the time you are at the point in which what to do about the tyrant is the question, you've already pretty much lost it, because it means that the negotiations that have maintained some kind of a proper civic order, that is collective self-government by citizens, has already broken down. And so then you're at the moment of now what to do. The whole tyrant killing story does come from reality. The aftermath of a oligarchic coup d'etat late in the Peloponnesian War, the Athenians did in fact swear an oath to support anyone who kills a tyrant. It was a very, I think, relevant part of their civic education. It was a public oath. You did it together with the members of your tribe in public, probably in the theater, where you would watch all of these lovely tragedies and so on. Intervisibly, you would see each other. So I am not just taking an oath in some quiet place, but rather I'm taking an oath with others, watching others take the oath. We are now really collectively bound to that. We have common knowledge of our commitment, and at least according to David Teagarden, who wrote the book on tyrant slaying and the formal legislation of tyrant slaying, this is actually a key part of the success story of democracy in the Greek world, not only in Athens, but thereafter, because it basically does create the space for avoiding the emergence of a tyrant. Basically, it's a sort of game theoretic argument that I'd sort of like to take over as tyrant, but there is a, as it were, first mover has been incentivized. You will be rewarded by the city if you, and so instead of thinking, who's gonna, everyone's gonna have a disincentive to attack me because I might have bodyguards and so on, but everyone has an equal incentive to attack me. So you work your way back. I guess I'll just have to try to be as influential as I can without actually taking over. So, so there is, I think, the ways in which it's possible to use, as it were, real tyrant killer kind of legislation as real civic education. To avoid the point, but if you're at the point in which, yes, there is a tyrant, what to do about him, either you better have had that kind of real world commitment to doing it, or you're thrown back onto, gee, I hear, I've created this whole story for myself.
Would you agree with that, Ted, that by the time we get to on the ground fears about a tyrant, that any sort of curriculum and studying past tyrants is at that point maybe a little bit too late?
Well,
Yeah.
that is way beyond my humble capacity
Yeah.
as a historian.
Yeah.
All I can tell you is what the Romans would have thought, and the Romans would have thought absolutely not.
Yeah.
That the only way in which people learn their civic duty and things like that, in any age, no matter how bad, is by looking to the past and understanding the excellent examples. I just expand on that briefly by saying one of the problems the Romans have with this working the machine education, which is so important in Athens, is their incredible suspicion of the present. Because, if you tell a young Roman, well, go and learn about politics by working the machine, no one would do that because you're going to get corrupt. Because in any given generation, the past is always good and the present is always terrible. So they're sort of, in a way, driven back on formal education, classroom education, which operates mostly in the past, because they never trust the present.
My last question before I open it up to the audience is related to education, but actually on the topic of speech. In both of your books, there is this sort of thread of a push and pull between the ability to speak freely, the invitation to speak freely within a a democratic or no boss context, but also the limitations that certain laws or institutions place on what is healthy or normal speech for a community. So Josh, in your book, you talk about the Athenian Assembly, which in theory, any male citizen should be able to say whatever he likes, but that the community plays an important role in shutting down irritating or obstreperous citizens. There's also instances of an amnesty in 404, 403 that limits Athenians' rights to legal retribution. And Ted, you really come at this more from the rigor of the rhetorical education, which again is not just teaching Roman young men to say whatever they like whenever, but is actually a very rigorous, regulated, rivalrous sense in which you have to say the right thing at the right time in the right context. So how do you think both about the balance of free speaking, but also heavily educated and thoughtful speaking in the role of a healthy democratic community?
Yeah, so if we think about the Athenian Assembly, they've got something like 6,000 to 8,000 citizens in a big Greek theater type environment. The acoustics are pretty good, but far from perfect. The key thing here is that the herald is going to announce the agenda. And then is going to ask who of the Athenians has advice to give. Now, in some cases, it may be nobody does. The agenda item comes with a recommendation from the council that we do X, and everyone says, it would be stupid not to do X, let's move on. But in many cases, there's going to be contention about this. There's going to be differences of opinion about what we should do. And at that point, anybody in the assembly, at least ideally, can come forward and speak. It's 8,000 people. Let's be very egalitarian about it. Everybody gets approximately 7 seconds. That's not going to work. We have to get this thing done by the end of the day. So the bottom line is we're going to have to listen to only a relatively few people. And we're going to have to listen to people who we think know what they're talking about. And those who are wasting our time are going to have to be shown off pretty quickly. How are we going to do that? Well, we're going to do that through basically collectively saying, sit down, let the next one speak, and maybe not so politely doing that. It was an absolute necessity that you demand useful speech in that public forum. Technically, anyone can say what they want, anyone can stand up, but we just cannot suffer fools. We have got to get the best possible policy and the reasonable amount of time. And in the background, then you have the Athenians had a commitment to this idea that, yes, you are free to speak, but you are indeed responsible for the predictable public consequences of public speech. And that ramifies into the famous case of Socrates, for example, which we could talk about.
Greece, Athens talks a lot about freedom of speech, and in fact, in accordance with your mass and elite book, is quite totalitarian in many cases. The Romans don't have a problem. They don't talk about freedom of speech hardly at all, and they don't need to, because they know that freedom of speech, like all forms of liberty, is proportionate to your standing. And they also know that wisdom is proportionate to your standing. So if you let the people of highest standing speak, you will hear the wisest advice. I mean, yes, I'm not saying it's right. This is sort of the baseline assumption in which they operate.
Yes, the Chinese Communist Party could not agree more.
Follow up on that. I mean, one thing that really emerges from your book, Ted, is that there isn't this assumption that just because you were born into an elite family, that you're naturally going to know what you need to say. I mean, sometimes modern education frames as though the child just needs to be gently guided. And the Roman rhetorical training system seems to assume that a grasp of the right sort of speech, the right sort of mannerisms, the right vocal intonation has to be sometimes quite literally beaten into children in order to make them worthy to be listened to. Does that conform to?
Yes, that does work.
Yeah.
It doesn't contradict what I
Yes.
just said, because
Yeah.
of course, only the children of the highest classes are getting that form of education. But yes, they are incredibly, they teach things we would never imagine teaching, like sort of how to hold your fingers.
Yes.
Those are regarded as intensely important. So I guess to the wider question of the Romans and freedom of speech, and what could say is that they're not concerned about it because for the top people, they have it, and they can't police the bottom people.
Yeah.
In Athens, you have a lot of policing by fellow citizens. The Romans police each other much less, particularly as the city gets enormous. Of course, the Senate, people at the very top under the empire, their speech is controlled by maestas trials and various other means, execution by the emperor. But if you get lower down, no one cares. And there's no state, there's no real ability to enforce anything.
So much. I think we'd like to open it up now for questions or thoughts from the audience. So maybe we can start with John Michaels.
Yeah, I asked Ted this last night, but thinking of tragedy as a civic education program, and they saw a lot of these tragedies, probably about 15 or 20 a year. And it struck me that if you say the Trojan women, the Acharnians is a comedy and all that, so much of this kind of anti-war rhetoric, argument, display, and all of that, very, very powerfully presented. At the same time, the Athenians were doing exactly the opposite and continued doing exactly the opposite through the whole period that these tragedies were being written. And so my question is, what are your thoughts on the effectiveness of this form of civic education? We think it's wonderful. We think it's grand. It's really important. But I don't see in Athenian public life or its foreign policy or its behavior, I don't see that it's had any effect.
So I think I guess the immediate response I would give is that civic education in the Athenian sense, frankly, in the way I would imagine it, cannot be about this is the correct policy. It can't be there is a decision fork and a good citizen would only choose this fork. Peace, not war, for example. Civic education has got to be, I think, broader than that. And at least if we're to follow through the idea that these tragedies had something to do with the education of the citizen, in a time in which Athens is being very aggressive, there's a lot of warfare. The tragedian and the comic poet says, do think about the costs. You cannot not think about the costs. So instead of just glorifying war and saying that this is just magnificent, look at the enemies, look at the skull piles that we have heaped up. I'm thinking of the Assyrians here who are really big on skull piles. Right. I mean, they put them in the art. There are these lovely artistic depictions of skull piles. So instead of that, you get the idea that war, it may be a necessity, maybe we are embarked upon it in a way that we must. Maybe it's the right thing to be doing. Still in all, it has terrible costs. And I think that a democratic society that is aware of the costs of the policies that we are pursuing in order to gain certain benefits is, a much better society and ultimately probably more effective because it allows you to then say, there may be some wars we're not going to take on. There may be some atrocities we're not going to commit. How effective this background civic education is in changing anything about how the Athenians actually do fight their wars would have to be done up against a counterfactual in which tragedy is all just about skull piles and their magnificence, and then how would the wars have been pursued? What would the history be? But I think at least plausibly we can say that it is different. That there is some difference in an education insofar as this is an education that sows the potential of doubt about the perfection of what we're doing as opposed to the necessity of what we're doing.
Could you talk a little bit about the concept of tyranny? Historically, is there a point in which that concept has clearly evolved and is well defined as a historical matter? And then talk a little bit about how does the civic education tend to define the tyrant in a world in which various kinds of pretty absolute exercises of authority, including in the family or slaves, are commonly accepted. Talk a little bit about when that concept becomes clearly identifiable and how that concept is increasingly defined if this definition kind of gets pretty cemented.
Yeah. You want to take us a little bit of Prometheus and Aristogeiton?
Me too.
Yeah.
Of course, in early Greece, tyrant just means a leader, and it is not a pejorative term. In fact, there are sort of old poetry and things saying, you know, I want to become a tyrant, it would be great. And everyone says the tyrant is the most blessed of men and things like that, because of course they can do whatever they like. By the time we get into serious prose writing, into Herodotus, there is already a very reified conception of the tyrant as a bad man with absolute power to be appropriately compared to the great king of Persia. And once they have that image, it sticks, not least because of the extreme conservatism of when they get formal education, the extreme conservatism of it. So it's pretty, the one thing that's not always clear is the philosophers insist that the tyrant is the most unhappy of men. That never really makes it over into rhetoric where tyrants have a lovely time.
That's great. If you had any other.
Right. Yeah. So I think the at least one sort of break point that we can see even before is with the poetry of Solon. So we're now in the early 6th century, well before the establishment of sort of full-bore democracy, and yet at the moment in which I would claim there's a really very clear civic bargain, or rather political bargain that leads to a civic bargain that is basically brokered by Solon. And Solon is aware of the attractions of tyranny. You know, he says that people say I'm a fool not to want to be tyrant, but I don't want tyranny. I reject tyranny. Now Athens goes on. A tyrant family does take over, but they are then all, as it were, constrained to maintain at least the forms of the laws of Solon. You basically can't break that baseline bargain that had been created by somebody who basically said, no, I'm not going to be that. I'm not going to use this special position to be a tyrant. But already, at least there's the possibility of saying, no, that's not the right thing for a civic leader is to pursue that. And I think that at least opens the way ultimately for the sort of hardening of the idea that the tyrant is simply wicked, which probably by the time we're at the end of the 6th century, with the apparently obstreperous behavior of the last surviving son of the tyrants of Athens, seems to then sort of solidify, and then the expulsion of the tyrant becomes, for the democratic imagination, the moment in which we, the people, took power and will never give it up.
And the tyrant defined how is the tyrant defined? How do you know if you've got one?
Yeah, is it because the tyrant is the boss? The tyrant can tell you what to do. The tyrant is not an official who is accountable to you. The tyrant never set down his authority, and he has the ability to, as it were, give commands that you do not have the right to push back on. So it is unaccountable authority that is in the hands of a person or a family.
If I could throw in, there's this interesting category of school exercises. There's not many of them, but in which, so a tyrant has overtaken your polis and then has been removed. And then there's these court cases about, and these are, again, students are sort of performing these in these mock declamations about people who committed crimes that were not crimes under the tyrant, but would be crimes according to the democratic laws prior. And so you have these sort of aftermath exercises, which I find so fascinating, because in this sort of imaginative post-tyrannical space, you have this imagined community working out what crimes were committed under tyranny and what are the ramifications for the state thereafter, which sometimes feel traumatizingly relevant when I'm watching the news. So anyway, any other questions? Please in the way back, yeah.
My training has always been in contemporary society, so I know very little about Asian society. And in course of the discussion, all three of you have referred to or mentioned educating a young man. So what happened to the female population, number one? So it keeps burning me. Okay. Are they not citizens? Number two, if they're not educated, then total population minus female minus slaves, then it's not a very educated society. So can you please tutor me on those issues?
This is a part of your book on Plato and conceptions of women, so maybe we could start with that.
Yeah, so I think that's really a very meaningful question. Aristotle, who has very peculiar ideas about the psychology of women, does make a point that the education of women is absolutely essential. It says if you don't educate the women in the background norms of the community, you will have left out the most important thing, because half of your population will be, as it were, ignorant of and potentially hostile to the rules that structure the structure of the community. So the question is how does that actually work in practice? Women don't get in Athens to work the machine. They don't get to attend the assembly. They don't get to be magistrates. They don't get to work on law courts. But we have reason to believe that they actually are very concerned with public affairs. And it's not just Plato and Aristophanes in one of his plays imagining the possibility of actually active, fully participative women. But there's a law case that from the middle of the 4th century BC, in which the person pleading the case, it's a prosecution against a woman who is charged with being a prostitute, but that's not the problem. The problem is that she's passed on her progeny as full Athenian citizens, and her daughter is married an Athenian citizen. It's the problem that as it were, purity of the citizen body is being corrupted. At any rate, at the end of this oration, and the thing that the last thing that's going to be ringing in the jurors' ears as they go forward, he says, "Well, imagine each of you will be, after this courtroom, going home to your families, and what will your wife and daughters ask you as you come in. They'll say, "What did you do today, dear?" "I was in the Niagara." "What did you do?" "We pled a case." "Oh, how fascinating." "Who was the defendant?" You will say, "It was Naira." And they'll say, "The notorious prostitute Naira, how did you vote?" So it's imagined kind of, but at least if the Athenian jurors who are hearing this say, "What are you on about? Women only care about baking bread and doing what they're told and so on," that argument wouldn't make any sense. And so I think that there's reason to think that at least some women did become interested enough in public affairs, and that the men who were in court and so on did feel that they had to justify themselves to the other half of the population.
To add, this situation is basically the same in Rome, particularly under the empire. You do get some immensely powerful women, usually members of the imperial house, but that power is always regarded as illegitimate, even if it exists de facto.
Sorry, did you have a follow-up comment?
So they actually had no access to education?
That's not what we know about, at least in Greece, about the education of women is limited. We certainly know there are highly educated women. We know that there are literate women. What we can't grasp is how broadly was literacy extended into the female population. Frankly, we don't even know how broadly it was extended into the male population, although the assumption is fairly broadly. So we just don't have any way to get at that. We don't have the kind of evidence that we'd like. But once again, civic education doesn't have to be, at least in my view, doesn't have to be formal education. It really is, at least in part, education in the norms and the rules of how we do things around here, and justification for why that is a fair and decent way of doing things.
It's a puzzle with respect. The Romans, we know that girls were sent to the lowest level of school, the ludus, to learn their numbers and their letters. We know that they were not sent to the highest level of rhetoric. We do not know whether, we know that it at least occasionally happened that they were sent to the middle level, the grammarian. We do not know how common that was. Nevertheless, there seem to have been women of enormous learning, and we have no way to figure out where they got it.
Yeah, there's the tombstone as well. I've been trying to track down from Asia Minor of a very low-level female educator who's holding a whip. It reminds me of my father's Catholic school education, his stories. But no, I mean, we get these tantalizing exceptions, but it is the sort of puzzle. Where do these exceptions come from if there is no regular standard institutionalized access for women to get educated? Yes, please. Yeah.
Well, just to that, there seems to be a disconnect a little bit between education in this discussion between education as we understand it nowadays and the civic education that Josh, you were talking about. If you're talking about civic education broadly construed, as you were construing it, then surely participation in rituals matters. And this is incidentally the way that women in the Lysistrata explain why they actually could participate and make decisions. They go back to rituals that they perform. So in terms of broadly construed civic education, one could and should argue that women were playing a very important role.
I think it's a great point. I mean, in the one Aristophanes play in which women are imagined as actually taking control, voting themselves power to be citizens, they had to pack the assembly with women who are dressed as men so that they could outvote the men and pass a new rule that says women will now be citizens. But they say that didn't we agree with a gathering together in advance and say, well, we remember what we agreed upon at the Skira Festival, at an all-women's festival. And clearly there was, as it were, some sort of a council of women or an assembly of women that worked out this whole plan, had a reason to do it, figured out how it would be done, decided when it would be done, and so on. So yes, the background world of ritual plays, I think, at least in this, quite directly into the possibility of actually having an active role in the public sphere.
I think I saw a question on this side.
Kind of along the same lines of, people liminal in their citizenship, like medics or slaves in Rome who but eventually become citizens if they're manumitted. You see attempts to civically educate them, like specific attempts to try and have them embrace this identity.
You don't need to at Rome because they've been in a familia. And that's the best type of education you could ever get. I think that's what a Roman would say.
I think that this is an open question in the Greek world or the Athenian world. We certainly see that metics are included in various rituals. For example, in the Panathenaic procession, there the metics are in their special red robes, and red is not the symbol of shame. It's honorific. But the notion of how broadly they are brought into this world, we don't really know. They are not in attendance at the assembly, but they certainly might be in the penumbra of people who are listening to law court cases. We know that it's not just the jury that listens to the case, that these are very popular events, and there's people on the outside who are listening to the arguments, partly because they're brilliantly put. The rhetoric is magnificent. The plots are fantastic, and so on. Medics may well have been there. So I think there's not sort of a neat answer to it. They don't get brought into, as it were, the formal being, inducted by your father, having service in the for the state, and yet, but I think as soon as we start thinking about the background culture, and especially the very sort of official cultural performances, medics become at least potentially part of that.
And of course, they do serve in the army.
And they serve in the army. That's right.
Ancient
Absolutely.
people regarded as uniquely educative for reasons that are a little mysterious to us.
I actually, if I could follow up as well on the slaves, I was under the impression that in the Roman Empire, at the very lowest levels of education, you could have freeborn children and enslaved children learning their letters and potentially even reading Aesop's fables together. And like, what are the very different messages that potential readers or students might? I don't tend to see the fable as the sort of famed slave discourse, I think, as strongly as others do. But I have thought about what is that communal experience to be a freeborn child and an enslaved child in the same learning context.
One wonders the degree to which, for very young children, it differed very much.
Yeah.
Everyone's getting hit all the time.
That's true. That's great. I think we have time for one more question. Hank, I'll give you the privilege. Yeah.
With rhetoric and education in Greece and Rome, there's sort of a huge difference in how they're perceived, right? I was hoping we could touch on the fact that for the Athenians, the ability to make the wrong argument sound good is seen as deeply subversive and quite alarming. Whereas for the Romans, at least by the late empire, it's sort of a charming performance that visiting scholars will put on. So how do we reach that sort of different understanding about rhetoric's role in society?
Well, I mean, I think this is basically does come down to what is the costs of having rhetoric go wrong. So there you are in the Athenian assembly. If the clever sophist, who actually cares nothing about really the long-term well-being of the community, but likes to demonstrate how well he can sway an assembly in order to bring on more students or to just simply demonstrate power. If that person is actually driving our policymaking, we're cooked. And I think that's what Ted was referring to when saying it's I mean, we can call it totalitarian, but it is necessary that we, the people, be able to judge the speaker. And if we judge you as someone who is not demonstrated a real commitment, not only through your speech, but through your life to the democratic community, then you're going to have a lot of noise every time you stand up because we don't trust you. You may be very clever, maybe you know some things, but you're just not trustworthy. You've got to actually demonstrate your loyalty to our collective enterprise because the cost of getting it wrong is catastrophically high.
I guess what I'd like to do is just sharpen the question, which I think is a really, really important one, which is that in classical Athens, rhetoric is regarded as dubious, morally dubious. In the Hellenistic world, Greek world, then all thereafter in the Greek world under Rome, but also in Rome, it is regarded as morally uplifting. That is, this is how young people learn morals, by learning declamation. And they, so far as I know, they never actually make the connection as to why that could be the case. It's just taken completely for granted, but it's an immense change. And I think it may be a question of the uniqueness of the Athenian democracy.
Yeah, I think it also does have at least something to do, once again, with the salience of the outcome. I mean, if you are basically concerned with ethical education, you want to form a character, then perhaps it is that declaiming in ways that allows you to internalize the virtues, courage, self-control, and so on is good. If rhetoric is about what are we going to do now in these do or die cases? Do we go to war? Don't we go to war? Do we raise the taxes? Do we lower the taxes? Things that really matter profoundly. Then, rhetoric had better be, as it were, in the public good. So fine, we'll listen to someone like Demosthenes. He's damn good at talking, but we won't listen to him if we begin to doubt that he is aiming at, which is very good at talking, the good of all of us collectively.
Thank you guys so much. If we give a round of applause to our speaker.